to the IELTS podcast. Learn from tutors and ex-examiners who are masters of IELTS preparation. Your host, Ben Worthington.
Hello there, IELTS students. In this tutorial, Daphne and myself, we're going to be talking about how long it takes to prepare for the IELTS exam. How are you doing today, Daphne?
Hi, Ben. Hi, everyone. I'm really good, thank you. Ben and I were just talking about how incredibly hot it is in Europe at the moment. So we're very happy to be just taking some time out inside, cool, and just discussing this today.
Absolutely, yeah. It's roasting. It's a perfect time to be studying inside if you've got air conditioning.
You do need that, absolutely, yes.
It makes such a difference. So yeah, join those other students in camping out at Starbucks or Costa or wherever you go. That's what I've been doing the last few days. I'm working and preparing these, updating the online course and carrying on, working with the students and helping them to pass the IELTS exam. So Daphne, before we get into this, how did you get into this? How did you start preparing students for IELTS?
Okay, well, I've been teaching, I started teaching general English, all levels, as you do in a language school. So language school in the UK, and you're thrown in at the deep end, and my classes were anything from kind of A2, elementary, up to the C1, advanced students. And then there was this magical class called IELTS preparation, which was only in the afternoon, and only certain students were allowed to do it. And it wasn't until after a couple of years of doing the general English that I was allowed to find out what the IELTS preparation class was all about, because it tended to be teachers who were very specialist, as we now know, and expert in what they do. And that sort of led me into the discovery of the world of IELTS. And I really liked the kind of discipline of exam training and exam preparation. And also for me, I think the IELTS is such an important exam, and it's such a high stakes exam. So I decided to specialize and to learn really all about the exam in order to start teaching. So that was my kind of getting into IELTS. But what about you, Ben?
I'll share. My story starts in Spain, but before I start that, I just want to mention that once you transition from a normal teacher to an exam preparation teacher, this is where you can separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, because the specialist teachers, sometimes they're getting paid by the results, but if they've got any shred of dignity, they'll want to be results-based tutors. So you've really got to step up your teaching skills once you get into this, because if you're just doing general English, there's not that much pressure on. But if you're doing exam preparation, you really need to specialize, because if your students aren't passing, you're not going to survive, basically.
You're right. There's so many issues involved in exam teaching, and keeping not only kind of knowing the exam, but the motivation for me is a really big thing. As a teacher, you have to stay positive, but also you've got to motivate your students, because they're the ones doing the hard work.
Absolutely, yeah. And also, I remember when I was teaching in Spain, I always used to teach standing up, because I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it sat down, because the students would switch off, I would switch off, and it just wasn't as dynamic. So I always did my classes standing up, and I think it drove some of the students.
Did you make them stand up as well, Ben? No, right, everybody, no chairs.
But really, just doing it standing up just introduced a totally different dynamic. It was a bit strange doing it one-on-one classes, but I didn't care. It just made it more dynamic. But like you, eventually I transitioned into doing the exam preparation. And then, because I was a bit lost at first, I started asking the other tutors, how did they prepare these students for the IELTS exam. I got some great advice, but I still wanted to go further because I wanted to be one of the best tutors there. So I started asking other tutors online and then ringing them up for calls, and then eventually started recording the calls, putting them out as podcasts. And you know what? I was getting some great advice, but I was also getting some terrible advice as well. So I was really, and because the only reason I knew it was terrible advice was because I was testing it with my students day in, day out. So I threw out what didn't work, kept what did work, and eventually that's how we got to the online course, basically, you know.
Well, that's really interesting because there is so much advice out there, isn't there? There's so much, opinions on IELTS, so many, do this, don't do that, don't do that. I mean, I think many students who come to us, they've had lessons elsewhere or language school, or they've had tutors before, and they're just going, please simplify this for me. Please just guide me through this.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what the course does brilliantly. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I was writing like hundreds of task 2 essays because I was finding it so frustrating myself. The first time I saw one, it was like really sneaky, the questions of like to what extent and all of this. But after writing so many essays, I eventually got it down to a system. And I think just to segue into the topic for today, which is how long it takes to prepare. I mean, it depends. If you're doing it on your own, like I was sort of like, how long does it take to prepare a student for IELTS? I mean, that was my situation, and it was taking me a long time. But if you get help, it speeds it up. So let's just jump into this tutorial today. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at language skills and IELTS preparation. We're going to look at some study advice, and then we're going to look at band scores as well. And throughout this tutorial, we'll be sharing some nuggets, some gold, basically, that we've collected and harvested from other students as well. And there's a great one about collocations, which I'll be mentioning later on. So I guess I've always said, if you've got the exam coming up in 3 days, then it's going to be really tough. But I think it depends on each situation. So, Daphne, just to ask you directly, is 1 month preparation enough for IELTS?
Oh, goodness me. I mean, it's a kind of one of those awful questions. How long is a piece of string? And I would kind of say possibly, but it all depends. So it depends on your current English level. So are you a kind of upper intermediate, B2, confident kind of user? How many hours you're prepared to study a day or able to study a day? And if you study alone or not. So I think those are the 3 big variables, Ben, aren't they?
Absolutely, yeah. And also I'll just add, how many hours of study per day is important, but it's also incredibly important the quality of those hours you put in. If you're watching TV and trying to do an IELTS exam at the same time, obviously you're not going to get the same benefit as if you were in your room with your headphones on and the door locked and just working through it. Also, if you study alone or not is a big factor. I'll just jump ahead a little bit, but the other day when I was talking with Gabriella, who had amazing IELTS results, after doing, she was in London, she'd been at this language academy, they didn't get the results that she wanted, she spent lots of money, eventually she joined us, but one really interesting nugget of information she shared was that for the IELTS Task 2, what she was doing was having conversations with her partner about it. So she was like saying, okay, what do you think are the causes of pollution, and how do you think governments can change this?
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah, and I know from personal experience that if you talk about this, and you're having a conversation and maybe you even squeezing out a few jokes about it, you're more likely to remember it, and especially if you're taking notes as well. So it's not just a case of sitting there in the room stressing, but if you can have a conversation about maybe the speaking topics or even the IELTS Task 2 topics, and maybe just work through a list, it's going to make it a much more pleasant experience.
Yeah, and that's such a good way to practice, Ben. And, you can almost look at a list of recent essay titles and just, talk about one every evening kind of thing. because you're not only going to be forced to think about your opinion, but also you're getting your partner's opinion or your friend's opinion, and you can just quickly make notes, as you say, afterwards, and that's your sort of essay planning done, and that may cover quite a lot of topics, mightn't it?
Absolutely. And this reminds me of the collocations that and the nugget that I got from VNOD, which I'll share later. But if you've got that list in front of you, then you could maybe even tick it off. You could play collocation bingo. for example. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So language skills and IELTS preparation. I'll just quickly mention this before Daphne dives into the Common European Framework of Reference, or the CEFR that we've talked about before. But I just want to say that this is really important, that you get it crystal clear, the difference between language skills and exam skills. Because native English speakers, as we've said many times before, they can fail this test because they're not aware of just totally unprepared, which i.e. their language skills are perfect, but their exam skills are not that good. So it really is a mixture of both of those areas.
Absolutely, and I would argue that you need to have competent enough language skills before you even attempt to work on the exam skills. They are, especially for IELTS, I know you may well have done the FCE, the first exam, or something like that. Each exam needs different skills. I think that's also important. But on CEFR, so this Common European Framework Reference, this is a really interesting one. I was looking at this the other day, Ben. A B2, so what we would call an intermediate CEFR user, would anticipate to get somewhere between 5.5 and 6.5 in IELTS. Now, I was quite surprised. I thought that might be actually higher. Whereas a C1 user, the estimate is roughly 6.5 to 8. I know that's a huge difference, 6.5 to 8, but that's a C1 advanced user, possibly only a 6.5. And then a C2, we're talking proficiency here, would be, they say, practically guaranteed 8 or 9. But then other end of the scale, a B1 intermediate, maybe only 4 to 5.5. I think that really shows you how difficult this exam is, and what a high level of language you need to have before you start.
Absolutely, and those are quite broad ranges. I thought, and it did surprise me as well, Daphne. There's like a B1 is only between 4 and 5.5. But I think, as we were saying before, there's a lot of factors here. You know, like I would guess that a C1 user taking the exam for the first time would probably be on the lower end of 6.5 to 8, whereas one who's just spent some time and got familiar with their exam and has got like a system for writing the Task 2 essays, or who has at least done some practice tests and exam skill preparation, they're obviously just going to be able to boost their score significantly just by being familiar with the exam.
Exactly. So they've got the language skills in the bag, and then after that it's the exam technique, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. And this is this reminds me of a really good piece of information that an ex-IELTS examiner told me, is that it's much healthier if you've got your language skills and then you go for your exam skills. Pretty much about what you've just mentioned, Daphne, that it's easier. I see a lot of students struggle where they're maybe at about 6.5 or around a 6, and they strongly believe that if they work on their exam skills, they're going to get that band 7. And I think this is what leads to an incredible level of frustration for students, because in their mind they've got it convinced that they need to find out this perfect essay structure, they need to find out this 5-paragraph model or whatever, and really that's not the case. You know, if they do a 5-paragraph model or whatever, but it's full of grammar errors, it doesn't matter if it's the most beautiful strategy in the world, it's still going to be band 6.
I think it was Aline who you were speaking to the other day on when you phoned her after her amazing results, and lovely Brazilian nutritionist from London, and sort of Brazil, but in London. And she said that really clearly. She said, we were working together on her essay corrections. And she said, I realized I had to get my grammar sorted out before I could move forward. And I thought that was brilliant coming from her as well. It was, okay, this is really holding me back, and I'm going to take some time and sort out these grammar things, which I keep on making these mistakes, get happy with that, and then I can move forward. And she really did. It was exactly what you're saying, sort out the language first.
Absolutely. But we also have had students that have got amazing language skills, but keep tripping up come exam day, and these are the ones who basically provide the stories where we say, for example, Deborah, I think it was episode 102, she jumped, I think it was up to band 7. She jumped 1.5 bands in 14 days. And
what? Wow.
And there's an even better one, Daphne, which was before you were working with us, and that's she jumped to band. That was Yvonne, and she jumped to band 7 in 3 days.
No.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. And these students managed to get these amazing results 9 times out of 10 is because they've got the language skills, but they're just a little bit lost when it comes to exam skills. So I think the key takeaway for the students here is that if you are stuck at a band score, usually it's 6.5, then it's probably, and you've taken a few tests, then it's probably the language skills, because the exam skills, I think they're quicker to learn, they're easier to implement, and those are the ones, that's why you can get fast results in a small amount of days. But if you've taken the exam quite a few times and you're still stuck at the same, then more than likely you're going to need to work on your language skills.
Yeah, absolutely. But how do you know your level, Ben? I mean, what are we talking about? B2 or B1 or C1? How would you know your level?
Good question. Okay, so there's a few different ways. I strongly recommend getting feedback, because this speeds up your improvement significantly, and you can go much faster this way, because by getting some feedback, you're only going to be working on what you need to work on, rather than working on a more like a broader range of subjects. So you can get some feedback. I just strongly recommend this for both the speaking and the writing. And at IELTSPodcast.com, we've got both of those services, the essay correction service and the speaking feedback service, which is proving very popular at the moment. And another way is you can go to the Cambridge English website. It's cambridgeenglish.org, test your English. And there's an online test, and you can work through, and it'll give you sort of like a rough estimate of what your CEFR level is, and that's the framework that's the framework we were just mentioning, of where it starts at A1 to A2, B1 to B2, C1 to C2, C2 being the highest. By the way, that's why we've got the C2 template in the online course. But you can go there, and that's a very solid way to start off, as well as getting the feedback.
Yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it? And at least if you know what you're aiming at, or then okay, if I'm coming out at a B2 and I need a band 7, then I'm going to have to put in some time on this one.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, so what could you say about exam skills and a student's IELTS preparation, Daphne?
Well, I think, this has come up time and time again, and this is what our students also say to us when we have a chat with them, is that you need to know what this exam is all about. So in the same way that anything in life, I suppose, you need to, if you're applying for a job, you need to know what the job is before you go for the interview. You need to be happy with the IELTS format. So you need to understand that the exam is in 4 sections. You will be tested in reading, listening, writing, and speaking. And you need to know the range of, so the skills, those are the skills that are going to be tested. but you also need to know what strategies to use. So this is, what is this exam? How am I going to do it? And what's the examiner looking for?
Absolutely, yeah. And I'll just mention, we're probably going to touch on this again in a few minutes, but the strategies, I think, is a bit of a trap for students, because as I was saying before, as Daphne mentioned as well, there is an abundance of information out there, and each tutor will say, okay, you need to do this 5-paragraph model. Oh, you need to do this 4-paragraph model. Oh, you need to listen for the keywords and the listening, whatever. And there is an abundance of strategies out there. And actually, I'll just go off on a side path, on a tangent here. But there was a famous YouTuber. Well, she's still out there, and she's actually being called out by by an official IELTS IDP British Council employee. And yes, and there was this speaker, and she was giving a talk about official IELTS materials and official sort of like practice strategies and stuff. And she said, look, on YouTube, there's this probably the most famous sort of like IELTS tutor, and it actually shows a snapshot of her giving incorrect advice to the students, and the speaker talks about it, said, look, this YouTuber is giving incorrect information because they're saying they do this, but that's it. The person giving the speech, she was an exam writer. She was the one writing the official exam, and she said, look, this YouTuber has changed the listening exam, and she keeps saying they tell you this, they tell you that, meaning the IELTS organization. But what the YouTuber had done is modified the exam so that she could demonstrate her point clearer. And it's so, just getting back to
that's really scary, so that you can't sort of have confidence in everything that you see.
Exactly. So this brings me on to the point that I want to make, is that you need to take responsibility for this and basically test out what works for you. So you don't take a blind approach. Work out figure out, if you do it this strategy, does it work? If not, throw it out. If it does work for you, then keep it and use it and master it, and then move on. So a good way to do this is to take practice tests, and you can get those from takeielts.britishcouncil.org, and work through those practice tests and then use the different strategies. I think a good source of these strategies is from students who've actually taken the tests. So if you listen to those past episodes of success stories that we publish, then these are real sort of like battle-tested strategies that students have been using. It's not some YouTuber who's modified the exam to try and make her point. So I'll put a link about this into this post when we publish.
Right. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think taking a practice test, there's a on the British Council you can find that, and I think we found, Ben, didn't we, on the IDP Australian site, you can do a mock timed test. So as if you were taking the computer exam, it starts you off on a timer and off you go on your reading, writing, listening, which is a really, I think, a very realistic way of working out what level you are, and showing you also what the test is all about. So I think that's quite useful. And then going on to what you were saying about strategies or tactics even, you can work out from there, okay, I'm pretty fast at reading, so I'm going to do it this way, or I'm pretty slow at reading, so I'm going to do it that way. You need to be aware of these different techniques, don't you?
Absolutely. And this is paramount if you are a self-study student.
Yes,
and
definitely.
I'll just take another segue. I'll go off on another tangent, but I think self-study students do have an advantage, because if you are in an academy and you're doing a lesson with 6 other students, if you're lucky and it's a small class, maybe you're unlucky and there's 15 in there, but there's the tutor talking, and then there's 15 other people in silence there. And it's that information that you're getting is kind of general. It's not tailored to you. So you can, and there's also the time that it takes to get to the study center, and I just think it's quite an old way of studying, is going to these language academies where, and especially nowadays that we've got the internet. So this is why I strongly believe in getting personalized, specific feedback be it for the writing or for the speaking. But let's just jump into how a tutor could help you. Ideally, they're going to identify your strengths, your weaknesses. They're going to suggest strategies for you to test, for you to try, and also they're going to give you the advice, specific advice, rather than just giving you general advice. For example, for a class of 15 students, they're going to give you a specific piece of advice that you can use for your specific problem. So this is why I'm a big believer in personalized feedback.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And going back to your point about a big class, in a big class, other people might struggle with something that you have no problem with at all, in which case you're going to waste that lesson because you think, well, I've got this. I'm happy on conditional sentences. I'm happy on complex grammar. I love that. Whereas a lot of people might struggle with that. But for you, so it may be that your grammar's okay, but your vocab's a bit weak, and you need to upgrade your style of writing to something more academic. And then obviously if you have a expert tutor who you're working with, they can work on that. So turn your weakness into a strength. This is exactly what we're trying to do, isn't it?
Exactly. And just one last thing about the classroom. You'll probably be aware of this as well, Daphne, but there is always one student that will dominate their classroom and dominate the conversation, and they'll be like
the vampire, Ben,
exactly, the time vampire is just starving for attention, never got any attention when they were a kid, and just wants to dominate the conversation and it's a good tutor will identify that and maybe just turn the volume down on those and try and get the shyer students to participate, but it's not always going to happen. And if you're just maybe a normal student who's neither shy nor extrovert, so to speak, then it's going to be, you're not going to really it's going to be difficult. You're going to have to really make an effort to get your money's worth, so to speak. So just moving on now, what can really help the students, what can really help you is a detailed study plan. And this is why in the recent update we've done to the Jump to Band 7 or its free IELTS course, we've included a detailed study sort of like spreadsheet where you can just fill in. And also in that doc, there are loads of sample activities, because I know it's quite difficult to prepare for this exam, especially you sit down and you're like, okay, what am I going to do? What could I do? And if you're in that situation, it's easy just to drift into the rabbit hole of YouTube or a rabbit hole of Google, and you're watching all these different videos that are kind of entertaining, but you're not really learning. Whereas if you're more action focused and you've got a detailed plan, then it makes it so much easier, and obviously it's going to be a more productive study session.
I agree. I think that's such a good idea to have a timetable. When you're revising for any kind of exam, you say, okay, let's make a timetable. Let's work out what you can do in the time you've got before the exam. But to have a study plan there in front of you is absolutely brilliant. I think it really helps you on the discipline and helps you keep focused, which is what you need to do.
Exactly. And also you're going to improve faster. When you're improving faster, you've got this momentum, and you're kind of like pulling yourself out of this sort of like IELTS frustration doldrums that a lot of students can find themselves in. When you're in the doldrums, when you're having a bit of a rough time, it's difficult to find that motivation. Whereas if you keep in a detailed plan and you look back at that schedule and you say, okay, I've put in 5 hours this week, I've put in 10 hours, you've got momentum. And then, especially if you're getting feedback on your work, especially if you just got your essay back and the teacher's like, oh, this is great, well done for implementing this, then you're just going to be in a much better frame of mind to keep moving forward.
Exactly. And I think the feedback is so important because, we have so many students who, some people find it easy to write essays. Some people find it incredibly hard to write essays. And they're putting so much sort of love and sweat and blood and tears into this essay. And sometimes it's not as good as they could do. But, I think part of the whole feedback thing is saying, okay, this wasn't your best, but you really got this sorted out, which was fantastic. The only thing you did wrong was slightly misinterpret the question. So next time, let's really work on understanding the question and going back to your plan really carefully before you start writing, and focus on that. So every time there's an improvement, it's just a question sometimes of tweaking it and, as you say, personalizing it, to just keep it relevant.
Absolutely. And there's just a few sort of like a bit of a list that we're going to share now to help you move faster. And then we'll be finishing. So we're near the end now. So what I want to mention is, once you've got your schedule, keep to it, treat it like your sort of like almost like your work schedule. I remember one student, he was a Filipino student in Singapore, and he based his whole preparation schedule around his work schedule, which was shift based, and so it was changing every week, so it was quite a challenge. But I think basically it'd be like, okay, if I've got a work shift in the evening, then I'm going to do my IELTS preparation in the morning. And what was really interesting was he would be basing it off getting feedback. So if he knew that his feedback, he would basically plan to write an essay, for example, Tuesday afternoon, and then Wednesday afternoon, he'd put in a session, or maybe Thursday morning, depending on his engineering schedule. He would basically put in his timetable, okay, I get my feedback. I will have my feedback by then, so that's exactly what I'm going to work on. I'm going to start extracting what I've learned from this feedback. And I'm going to maybe do a practice test as well, or I'm going to just review the grammar rules. So this is why a schedule is very important, and getting a routine and planning. If you don't make your own plan for yourself, you fall into somebody else's plan, which is nowhere as near as good as your own plan for yourself.
Exactly, a good example there, Ben. Absolutely, yeah. And I think so. Start off working on your weak points. So as we said before at the beginning, make sure your language skills are where they need to be, and keep a record of your results. So keep a record on the feedback that you're getting. You're making progress. Note what's good. Use it again, the good things, and then work on the things that weren't so good. So I think it's like building bricks, isn't it?
Absolutely. There's just 3 things I want to mention here. For, as Daphne said, making a note and logging where you're improving and where you need to and where you not only where you are improving, but what you've done bad, but what you've done good. Because if you just focus on your mistakes, you could easily get yourself down. And when you're down, it's harder to find the motivation. So not only write down your mistakes, but write down what you've done well, and you're more likely to use it again. The second thing is, this is so important. This is why we've included a personal error sheet in the new course updates, which students can work through, and they can it's basically a framework where you can say, okay, what did I do right? What did I do wrong? And what do I need to improve? And where can I get those resources? So you log everything. And then if you forget that grammar point that you learned last week, you've got it in the document, and you can go back to that article that helped you learn it the first time, rather than starting out and doing the whole search again.
Yeah, that is really great. The students definitely who take the time to do their corrections. It is time consuming. I know that, we know that. But the people who do the corrections really improve fastest. Absolutely.
And just one last thing. When you are in the midst of doing all your IELTS preparation, and maybe, life gets in the way, as we've said, sometimes you take a day off or a few days off, and then you get back into it, and you may lose some time just reorientating yourself with where you were and what needs to be done. So I always recommend just writing a debrief. So when you've finished a study session, just write, okay, in this session, I spent 2 hours looking at listening test questions, and for the next session, I need to master yes, no, not given. And then when you come back to your work and you read this debrief, within minutes, you're automatically productive. Whereas if you didn't write that debrief, you could find yourself just doing a whole new mock test, and you're not going to get the same bang. Or you're not going to get as much value from that hour of study as if you had done when you followed your notes or your debrief.
That's a great idea. So when you sit down at your desk, you know exactly where to pick up, and you're not kind of trying to kind of think about, oh, where was I last time? That's a really good tip.
Yeah. Okay. And another tip is as Daphne mentioned, really find your weak spots and focus on those. And this is quite straightforward to do, I think, with the practice tests, especially for reading and listening. For the writing and speaking, it's a little bit more challenging because ideally you want to have a human there giving you the feedback, ideally as we have, like ex-IELTS examiners giving feedback on the essays and also with the speaking. So any other pieces of advice you'd like to add there, Daphne? Oh, Daphne's gone. Okay, so it's just me. I'm sure she's going to jump in. All right, so moving on to the next section. Just one last thing, actually. Don't avoid the tough work. You really want to roll up your sleeves and jump straight into that. Mock tests are a fantastic idea, but don't take 2 or 3 days to do a single mock test. If you're doing a mock test, ideally do it under exam conditions, especially the closer to the exam you get. Now, final point about band scores and the amount of time that you practice. So this is quite a bit subjective, but roughly it's 1 band score. I mean, you can improve 1 band score per month of study. So if you were on a 6, then if you want to get to a 7, it's roughly going to take you 30 days. Now, what you do in those 30 days, obviously it's going to be longer if you're working a full-time job in McDonald's, for example, or in an office. Obviously, it's going to take you more than a month. But if you are a full-time student, for example, and you're on holidays and you've got no job, then dedicated focus for 30 days should be able to boost your score by 1 whole band level. But it should, and it's highly subjective. And also you've got to take into account that different students learn at different rates, and also it depends on the quality of information that you're using to prepare. So in our online course for the writing, specifically for the writing, you've got a tried and tested process, a system that can really help the students improve. So I think the biggest takeaway from here is that don't waste your money taking test after test after test. If you're in that situation, then it's probably language skills that you need to be working on. So don't waste your money taking test after test after test. Just take a step back. Focus on your language skills. Put in some serious time, and then come back and take the language test. Take the IELTS test again. But put some serious time in there, and you will see an improvement. Otherwise, you can really end up getting frustrated, getting annoyed, and getting depressed, and really just, throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. So keep moving forward. That's it for me today. Remember, as I said, if you sign up, or when you sign up for the IELTS podcast email list, we'll send you some special offers, and we've updated the IELTS materials document, so now it includes lists of collocations from listening exams, which I think is a massive, massive, massive help for students, especially in the listening especially those struggling with the listening exam. So we're always improving and we're always working towards getting better results for our students. So that's it from me today, and Daphne, I'm going to say goodbye on behalf of Daphne as well. Just remember, keep moving forward and you will get there. All the best. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to IELTSPodcast.com.